Hello all, my name is Ben and this is Uncharted X. In several previous videos on this channel, we've explored the origins of South America's ancient and mysterious megalithic ruins and architecture. Ruins that are found across many sites in the regions of modern-day Peru and Bolivia, particularly in the highlands that are defined by the sprawling and mighty Andes mountain range. The forms of this remarkable work, the flowing shapes carved into the monolithic living rock, and the iconic massive polygonal masonry walls, stand in stark contrast to the primitive and pervasive building style that is also often seen on and around this megalithic work, that of the rough stone walls that are made up from loosely shaped small stone blocks. Despite these distinct and disparate forms of ancient architecture, in today's history classes and in textbooks all around the world, these ancient sites and their masonry are all broadly attributed to but a single civilization, that of the Inca, who are thought to have built everything that we can see here. This is something of a strange claim, as it seems to stand counter to the obvious disparity of technological capability shown by these different building styles, styles that seem to indicate multiple and very different periods of construction. While it's unarguably true that the Inca occupied and worked on these ancient sites, much of the megalithic architecture that we can find in places like Cusco, Tambo, Tiwanaku and Machu Picchu seems obviously beyond their known and somewhat primitive capabilities. This disparity in architecture is never really addressed from a technological perspective by our scholars. Rather, the fine megalithic work is often termed as Imperial Inca, in order to distinguish it from the vastly inferior masonry that is found all around it. I've also heard these sites described as being an organic style, in which the Inca sought to encompass all styles of stonework. This insistence is also a modern phenomenon, one that has only risen to prominence in the last 50 years or so. Prior to these modern times, academics, explorers, and authors seemed much more willing to embrace the mystery of South America's history. So it's here that this story begins, in the works of the academics, explorers, and travellers of centuries past. The more that I've researched the history of this region, the more it has become clear that not only did these authors from a different age understand that the Inca were but the most recent of South American civilizations to occupy these places, they also understood the nature of the achievements that are wrought in the megalithic architecture, and that they themselves are proof for a much more advanced and far older history of this region. In this video, I want to share with you some of the writings, the logic, and the reasoning for just such a history of South America, a history that comes to us from one of these eminent authors, researchers, and explorers. Sir Clements Markham was born in England in 1830. He started his career serving in the Royal Navy and eventually went on to become both the Secretary and then later the President of the Royal Geographical Society. He is perhaps best known for his work that reinvigorated Britain's interest in explorations of Antarctica. Mount Markham on that continent is named after him. However, this was but one of his interests, and over the course of his life, he was a prolific author and a constant world traveller. South America, the New World as it was yet still known in his time, and in particular the history of the Andean region, was a lifelong obsession for Markham, and he penned books about this region throughout his life based on research that spanned a period of some 60 years. Markham was very much an active researcher, spending long periods investigating this region firsthand, and he combined this with a voracious appetite for the very few texts and primary sources that speak of this period of conquest by the Spanish, and of the even fewer details that they give us as to the history that preceded their invasion of South America in the 16th century. He also engaged with indigenous record keepers and the descendants of the Inca, and in fact maintained correspondence with several native Peruvian experts over a period of decades, never ever losing interest in the mystery represented by this region. Both his travels and his research led him to be sympathetic to the plight of the Incas, and, as reflected in the following passage from the introduction to one of his first books on this topic, he gently chides his fellow authors for their focus on the deeds of the Spanish, their neglect of the history that preceded them, and for their lack of first-hand experience in the area. Quoting Clements Markham from his book Cusco and Lima, published first in 1856, from the introductory chapter. Quote, Chapter 1. Introductory. There are few more attractive periods of history than that which treats of the adventures of the lawless conquerors of the New World, who shattered at a blow the fabrics of stately empires, and so utterly prostrated the once thriving civilized communities of Peru, Mexico, and Bogota, that a century after the arrival of the Spaniards scarce a vestige of them remained. Their origin obscured by the mist of ages, their rise comparatively rapid, and their fall sudden and forever. In the masterly pages of Prescott have been recorded, in glowing language, the deeds of those stony-hearted warriors who uprooted them, and everyone knows the history of Cortes and Montezuma, of the courageous Cuauhtémoc, of Pizarro and his strangled victim, and all the wonderful, almost incredible tales of Spanish prowess. Surpassing in wonder the tales of Amadis de Gaul or Arthur of Britain, yet historically true, the chronicles of the conquest of the New World, the voluminous pages of the Inca Garcilaso, and the simple record of the true-hearted old soldier, Bernal Diaz, are the last, and not the least, wonderful narratives of medieval chivalry, and commemorate that brilliant interval which ushered in the modern spirit of enterprise and improvement. But in the eager search for information with regard to the conquest of America, the deeply interesting history of its anterior civilization has been comparatively neglected, and the bloodthirsty conquerors have been deemed more worthy of attention than their unfortunate victims. Volumes have been devoted to the deeds of the blood-stained Pizarro, the fanatic Valverde, and their greedy followers, while a few pages suffice for a record of the Incas whom they destroyed, of their mythical origin, their wonderful career, and the beautiful episodes in their history, whose interest is enhanced by the majestic scenery amidst which their valorous deeds were performed. It is a field of investigation which has been left almost entirely untouched, and the sketches of the civilization of the Incas by Robertson and others are only collected from Spanish chronicles as introductions to the bloody history of the conquest which follows, and are composed by students who, though masterly in their powers of collecting the gold from the dross in the old chronicles and manuscripts of Spain, have never themselves gazed with rapture on the towering Andes, nor examined the native traditions of the country they described, nor listened to the sweet but melancholy Inca songs, nor studied the beautiful language in which they are written. Of the few English travellers in Peru who have, in modern times, given their narratives to the world, none with whom I am acquainted have visited the once splendid and imperial Cusco, the city of the Incas, and the surrounding country, that charming land whose lovely valleys abound in the most interesting architectural remains. It was therefore to be expected that much which would assist in elucidating the former condition of this remarkable country might be learned in a visit to the actual scene of the deeds of the Incas by anyone who would be at the pains to undertake such a journey." End quote. I have to say that I really do enjoy the use of the English language in books coming from previous centuries, and I also very much agree with Markham's sentiment here. Visiting these ancient sites in person and experiencing the environment, walking the same paths, climbing the same steps as our fellow humans have been doing in these locations for millennia, undeniably grants travellers and researchers some perspective, and I'd highly recommend it. I'm sure it's possible to be an expert on these ancient cultures and sites without actually walking them in person, but Markham is expressing that a whole other dimension of understanding can come from the first-person experience. The very same position is succinctly expressed here by Graham Hancock, another tremendously articulate writer and speaker, who's walked the walk of first-hand experience all over the world. And in this case, he's discussing ancient Egypt with the skeptic Michael Shermer on the Joe Rogan Experience.
And you've been to Giza, though?
No, I've never been to Giza.
Oh dear.
In that introductory chapter, Clements Markham is also noting that of all the contemporary sources of Inca history in South America, the vast majority of it focuses on the deeds of the Spanish and the specific events of their conquest. From this short list of authors, however, there is some small information to be gained about the history of the Inca before these times, even if it is only mentioned in passing or as a brief introduction to the arrival of the Spanish. Markham returns to this very point nearly 60 years later in the last book that he completed before his death in 1916. Titled The Incas of Peru and first published in 1912, this is the culmination of his lifelong research into the history of South America. The very first chapter of this book is titled The Tellers of the Story, and in it he describes the diversity of authors and sources from which all known information of this period flows. And these are the very same authors and sources that our modern crop of archaeologists and academics have to work with, most of whom seem to come to far more certain and wildly different conclusions than did their predecessors of the Victorian era. Although Markham had a variety of interests across the course of his life, his research into the history of the Inca was a constant. Along with his travels, he was an expert in the Quechua language, and he was intimately familiar with all of the primary sources. Quoting now some excerpts from this first chapter of 1912's The Incas of Peru. Quote, Chapter 1. The Tellers of the Story. Before entering upon a contemplation of the Inca history and civilization, a story of no ordinary interest, it seems natural to wish for some acquaintance with those who told the story. It is not intended to enter upon a full critical examination of their work. That has been done elsewhere. It will suffice to give a more popular account of the tellers of the story. Rude and destructive as most of these Spanish conquerors were, and as all are generally supposed to have been, there were some who sympathized with the conquered people, were filled with admiration at their civilization and the excellent results of their rule, and were capable of making researches and recording their impressions. Nor were these authors confined to the learned professions. End quote. Markham goes on in this chapter to describe the variety of soldiers, lawyers, priests, indigenous Inca, and mestizos, which means half-blood or of mixed Spanish and Inca descent, who were contemporary with this period and also wrote about it. Garcilaso de la Vega, whom I've quoted on this channel several times, whom Markham calls, quote, the Inca Garcilaso, end quote, was a mestizos himself, and is still today considered to be one of the most important primary sources of this era. Markham also notes that many manuscripts and accounts from this time are lost to us, with only fragments remaining, and that given the variety of sources, some discrimination is required in order to ascertain the truth of events. Quote, We have seen that the story of the Incas has been told by priests, soldiers, lawyers, by mestizos, and by pure-blooded Indians. Seeing the same acts and events from different points of view, hearing them from various people, biased by prejudices which tend to obscure the truth, some desirous of securing accuracy, others thinking more of proving their case, some transparently honest, others less so in varied degrees. It is evident that discrimination is called for after careful study. The following essays are the results of such study by one who has devoted many years of research to a most interesting and fascinating story. End quote. In my recent studies on Machu Picchu, I recounted the Inca origin story, as told by Hiram Bingham, a story that spoke of a remarkable civilization existing thousands of years ago, of a megalithic people who built the massive works at Sacsayhuaman, Cusco, and Ollantaytambo, of a civilization that fell and eventually, centuries later, gave birth to the Inca. In Markham's book, I further learned of another interesting Inca tale that stands opposite to our current insistence that the Inca alone were the progenitors of the megalithic work in Peru and Bolivia. I'm referring here to the little-known Inca kings list. Much like the ancient Egyptian list of kings and the Sumerian king list, the Inca kings list takes the history and origins of the Inca civilization far further back in time than is currently accepted, and, in my estimation, connects them more closely to the previously mentioned great megalithic civilization that must have existed in this region. Quoting again from Markham's book, The Inca of Peru, quote, Chapter 3. The List of Kings. A long list of 100 kings of Peru, including the Incas, was given in the writings of Fernando Montesinos, who was in Peru from 1629 to 1642. The writer was credulous and uncritical, and his information was collected a century after the conquest, when all the instructed Indians who could remember the days of the Incas had passed away. Little credence has, therefore, been given to the list hitherto. But Dr. Gonzalez de la Rosa has recently adduced good reasons for the belief that Montesinos merely copied the list of kings, which was well known long before his time. It was compiled, almost certainly, by Blas Valera, when learned men of the time of the Incas were still living, Valera himself being the son of an Indian mother, and the language of the Incas being his mother tongue. The list, therefore, comes to us on the highest authority as a genuine tradition of the learned men of Inca times. It is thus placed in quite a different position and calls for serious consideration. The list of kings, assuming Blas Valera to have been the compiler, was derived from the ancient Quipu records, expounded by learned men of the time of the Incas, called Amautas and Quipu Camayocs, who had charge of these records previous to the Spanish conquest. It is conceivable that such records may have been preserved. The ancient Peruvians, like other races in the same stage of civilization, were genealogists and had an unusual number of words to distinguish relationships. The chronology of the list, as shown by the length of reigns, is not exaggerated. It gives an average of 25 to 27 years for each reign. It is true that, if the whole represents a succession of fathers and sons, it would take us back to 950 BC. End quote. Markham here mentions the Quipu records, which was the ingenious system of knotted cords used by the Inca to preserve information. These functioned something like a mnemonic device or a memory aid, with each knot on specific cords corresponding to memorized names in the case of this list, or other data for other types of information. In this way, it was possible, even without a specific written language, to preserve data down through time by combining such a memory aid with oral tales and memorization. The Amautas, which means learned one or wise one, were the record keepers and teachers of the Inca, and even during periods of downturn and conflict, much like the priesthoods of Egypt, they were able to keep records, information, and sacred knowledge intact and passing down through generations. The chronology of this list of kings takes the Inca civilization back to around 950 BC, which is roughly 1,300 years older than our current estimation of the beginnings of this culture, which, according to academics, arose around 1200 AD. When you combine this list with the Inca origin story and with the obvious evidence of antiquity in the megalithic architecture of the Andean region, I think there is significant evidence that the history of human civilization in this area is far older and more complex than is currently credited. Recall that from the Inca origin story, as related by Hiram Bingham, this megalithic civilization, the one that created the great works at Cusco, Sacsayhuaman, and Ollantaytambo, existed thousands of years before the Inca. Eventually, it fell from its mighty heights, and only after centuries in isolation eventually gave birth to the Inca. Presumably, this would be considered the beginning of the King's List, and I think the origins of this mysterious megalithic civilization could well stretch far further back into time. As Graham Hancock is fond of saying on Twitter, stuff just keeps on getting older. And this seems to be a recurring theme all over the planet, the more that we investigate with open minds. As a recent example of this, in news from North America, an archaeological dig in Oregon has recently driven another nail into the coffin of the Clovis First doctrine, with the discovery of a stone tool, a tool that was found underneath an undisturbed layer of ash from a Mount St. Helens eruption that dates back to 15,800 years ago. Furthermore, they found blood on this tool, blood that has been identified as likely coming from an extinct species of bison, one that died out shortly after the global destruction of the Younger Dryas period around 12,800 years ago. So now that we have established some context and, I think, established Clements Markham's credentials as an expert who investigated and published books on this region for some 60 years, I want to get to the chapter of his book that was the inspiration for this video. I was busily researching for an upcoming video on Ollantay Tambo when I came across this, and I just had to stop and do a specific piece on what he wrote here, as I found it quite remarkable. Chapter 2 of his book, The Incas of Peru, is titled The Megalithic Age, and I'm going to read most of this chapter, which I think represents Markham's solid use of research and logic in order to give his estimation of the origins of the Inca civilization. I'll set this reading to my footage and photographs, as I've been to all the places that he mentions in this tale, and I've seen and documented all of the artifacts that he discusses. Quote, Chapter 2, The Megalithic Age. There is a mystery still unsolved on the plateau of Lake Titicaca, which, if stones could speak, would reveal a story of the deepest interest. Much of the difficulty in the solution of this mystery is caused by the nature of the region in the present day, where the enigma still defies explanation. We must, therefore, first acquire some knowledge of the face of the country before we have the question, as it now stands, placed before us. The great Cordilleras of the Andes, in latitude 14 degrees 28 minutes south, unite at the knot of Vilcanota, and then separate, forming the eastern Andes on one side containing Illimani and Ilampu, except Aconcagua and Huascaran, the loftiest measured peaks of the New World, and the maritime Cordillera on the other. Between them there is an extensive and very lofty plateau, 13,000 to 14,000 feet above the sea, with the lake called Titicaca or Inticaca at its center. Titicaca is the largest lake in South America. It was formerly much larger. The surface of the lake is 12,508 feet above the sea, that of the plateau being, on an average, several hundred feet higher. The surrounding mountains form a region of frost and snow. The hardy llamas and alpacas live and breed amidst the tufts of coarse grass called yuchu, and the graceful vicunas can endure the rigorous climate at still higher elevations. Besides the grass, there is a lowly shrub called tola, which can be used as firewood. Quinoa, belonging to the spinach family, can alone be raised at the higher elevations, yielding a small grain which, by itself, is insufficient to maintain human life. The plateau itself, called the Callao, is by no means level. It is intersected by ranges of hills of no great height, and in the northern part the lofty rock of Pucara is a marked feature. Very hardy trees of three kinds, though stunted, are a relief to the landscape, and in some sheltered ravines they even form picturesque groves overshadowed by rocky heights. Crops of potatoes are raised, forming the staple food, with the oca and some other edible roots. But cereals will not ripen, and the green barley is only used for fodder. The yutu, a kind of partridge, and a large rodent, called vischaka, abound in the mountains, while the lake yields fish of various kinds and is frequented by waterfowl. Such a region is only capable of sustaining a scanty population of hardy mountaineers and labourers. The mystery consists in the existence of ruins of a great city on the southern side of the lake, the builders being entirely unknown. The city covered a large area, built by highly skilled masons, and with the use of enormous stones. One stone is 36 feet long by 7, weighing 170 tons, another 26 feet by 16 by 6. Apart from the monoliths of ancient Egypt, there is nothing to equal this in any other part of the world. The movement and the placing of such monoliths point to a dense population, to an organized government, and consequently to a large area under cultivation, with arrangements for the conveyance of supplies from various directions. There must have been an organization combining skill and intelligence with power and administrative ability. The point next in interest to the enormous size of the stones is the excellence of the workmanship. The lines are accurately straight, the angles correctly drawn, the surfaces level. The upright monoliths have mortices and projecting ledges to retain the horizontal slabs in their places, which completed the walls. The carvings are complicated and at the same time well arranged, and the ornamentation is accurately designed and executed. Not less striking are the statues with heads adorned with curiously shaped headdresses. Flights of stone steps have recently been discovered, for the ancient city, now several miles from the lake, was once upon its borders. Remarkable skill on the part of the masons is shown by every fragment now lying about. Such are the angle joins of a stone conduit, a window frame of careful workmanship with 9 apertures, all in one piece, and numerous niches and mouldings. There is ample proof of the very advanced stage reached by the builders in architectural art. There are some particulars respecting the ruins in Oliva's History of Jesuits in Peru, obtained from an Indian named Katari, a Quipu Kamoyak, or reader of the Quipus, who was living at Cochabamba at the end of the 16th century. It appears that Bartolome Cervantes gave to Oliva a manuscript dictated by Katari. The remarkable statement is here made that no judgment can be formed of the size of the ruined city because nearly all was built underground. Professor Nessler of Prague has proceeded to Tiwanaku with the object of making researches by the light of the account of Katari. The famous monolithic doorway at Tiwanaku has been fractured, probably by an earthquake. The lower part has not yet been excavated, so that it is not known whether the two sides are connected below or separate. The elaborate carving on the upper part may possibly hold the mystery. In the centre there is a square of 17.5 inches, on which the principal figure is carved. The space is nearly square, surrounded by a border with billet ornaments. There are 2 round indentations for eyes, a nose, mouth, and 3 small holes on each cheek. The billet ornaments occur again on the sceptres and on the belt." End quote. Markham goes on here for several pages describing the details of the central figure in the carving on the front of what he calls the monolithic doorway at Tiwanaku. This is known today as the Sun Gate, and it was moved from its original location, put back together and mounted into a modern foundation in 1908, and it's still found in that location today. This is but one of many artifacts at Tiwanaku that show some incredibly intricate detail, and the images you're seeing of it now come from my quite rare copies of Professor Arthur Poznański's detailed volumes about the site, titled Tiwanaku, the Cradle of American Man. These are giant tomes of books, filled with many colour prints, photographs, detailed fold-out maps, surveys, and much more. They were self-published by Poznański in the 1940s. Poznański believed that this sun gate was in fact a very complex calendaring and seasonal record, with the central figure representing the sun and the spring equinox, and he documented, photographed, and analysed this and several other artefacts in exquisite detail in his work. I do intend to produce features on these aspects of Poznański's work in the future, so without getting too far ahead of myself here, I'll summarise what Clements Markham wrote about this doorway. The figure has 22 ribbons surrounding its head, with riband being Old World speak for ribbon. These ribands issuing from the head of the figure end in a variety of shapes, circles, as well as animal heads. Markham admits that these could be interpreted as sun rays, but their different shapes and arrangement also seems to point to some other symbolic meaning. The figure is depicted above what might be a throne of some sort, and is holding 2 sceptres. Below the hands, these sceptres are identical, but above the hands they differ, the one on the right with 5 joints, the one on the left divided into 2 and ending in the heads of birds. Below the belt on the figure there is a band with a hanging fringe of 6 human heads. Resuming Markham now, as he describes the surrounding components to the central figure on the sun gate. Quote, "On either side of the central figure there are 48 figures kneeling to it, 16 with the heads of birds and 32 with human heads. All are winged, all are crowned, and all hold sceptres. The bird-headed worshippers have sceptres like the one in the central figure's left hand, while the sceptres of the human-headed worshippers are the same as those in the central figure's right hand. The bird-headed figures have ornamental bands with terminals of fish heads, and the human-headed figures throughout have bands ending in birds' heads. It is difficult to avoid the conclusion that the central figure is intended to represent the deity having jurisdiction over all human beings on the one hand, and over the animal creation on the other. Below the rows of worshippers, there is a beautifully carved border consisting of double lines ending with birds' heads, surrounding human heads with borders of joints and billets, surmounted in 1x5 bands ending in circles, in another by 4 fish heads, in another by an armed human figure. There is no sign of sculpture nor of any knowledge of proportion in designing a human figure, but at the same time there are indications of a very remarkable skill and taste in the Masonic art. The ornamentation is accurately designed and executed, and the style of art is well adapted for symbolical representation. The tendency is to straight lines and rectangles, not to curves. This, then, is the mystery. A vast city containing palace, temple, judgment hall, or whatever fancy may reconstruct among the ruins, with statues, elaborately carved stones, and many triumphs of the Masonic art, was built in a region where corn will not ripen and which could not possibly support a dense population. It is quite certain that, in the time of the Incas, the people were absolutely ignorant of the origin and history of these edifices. They were to them, as they are to us, mysterious ruins. The statues gave rise to a myth referring to a former creation by the deity, rising from the lake, of men and women who, for disobedience, were turned into stone. This was to account for the statues. The name of Tiwanaku is modern. It is said that an Inca happened to receive a message when visiting the ruins, and he compared the rapidity of the runner to that of the swiftest animal known to him. Tia, Huanaku, he said, "Be seated, Huanaku," and the place has since had that name. When the Spaniards arrived, the ruins were very much in the same state as they are now. The Jesuit Acosta, who took measurements of the stones, speaks of them as ruins of very ancient buildings. Chiesa de Leon mentions 2 gigantic statues which were much weathered and showed marks of great antiquity. An old schoolfellow of Garcilaso, in writing to him, described the ruins as very ancient. The builders may best be described as a megalithic people in a megalithic age, an age when cyclopean stones were transported and cyclopean edifices raised. The great antiquity is shown by the masonry and symbolical carving, but this is not the only proof that Andean civilization dates back into a far distant past. The advances made by the Andean people in agriculture and in the domestication of animals must have been proceeding from a very remote period. Maize has been brought to a high state of cultivation, and this must have been the result of careful and systematic labour during many centuries. The cultivation must have been commenced at so remote a time that it is not even certainly known from what wild plant the original maize was derived. The wild potato, however, is known. It is a small tuber, about the size of a filbert, which has scarcely increased in size after a century of careful cultivation. Yet the Andean people, after many centuries of such cultivation, produced excellent potatoes of several kinds, for each of which they had a name. The same may be said of the oca and quinoa crops. The agricultural achievements of the Andean man are evidence of the vast antiquity of his race in the same region. The domestication of the llama and alpaca furnish additional evidence to this antiquity. There is no wild llama. The Huanaku and Vicuna are different animals. It must have been centuries before the llama was completely domesticated, carrying burdens, yielding its wool for clothing and its flesh for food. Individuals are of various colours, as is usual with domesticated animals, while the wild huacanas have fleeces of the same colour. The domestication of the alpaca must have taken an equally long period, and called for even greater skill and care. There is no wild alpaca, and the tame animal is dependent on man for the performance of most of its functions. It must have taken ages to bring the silken fleeces to such perfection. There is thus good reason for assigning very great antiquity to the civilization of the megalithic people. Another deduction from the premises is that there must have been a dense population for working quarries, moving the cyclopean monoliths from a distance and placing them, as well as for cultivation and the provision of supplies for the workers. This suggests extensive dominions and some movement of the people. We only have tradition to indicate the direction whence the megalithic people came. I am quite in agreement with Dr. Brinton that, quote, the culture of the Andean race is an indigenous growth, wholly self-developed, and owing none of its germs to any other races, end quote. Mr. Squire came to the same conclusion as regards Peru, and Mr. Maudsley as regards the Mayas of Central America. There were doubtless movements amongst the Andean tribes, gradual progress extending over vast periods of time, and an influx from some direction to form the megalithic empire. But from what direction? Tradition points to the south, to Charcas and Tucumán, and to countries beyond the southern tropic as the sources of its population. It is interesting to find Garcilaso de la Vega in one of his letters describing himself as an, quote, Antarctic Indian, end quote. Chiesa de Leon, the earliest author to collect native traditions, tells us that the people came from the south. Betanzos also makes the civilizers advance from the south. Sacsayhuaman says that all the nations of Peru came from the south and settled in the various regions as they advanced. Molina has the same tradition. Montesinos mentions a great invasion from the south in the very earliest times. Later, the records tell of the arrival of an army from Tucumán, and he tells of a third great invasion from the south when his 62nd king was reigning. On this point, there is practical unanimity. The great population, of the existence of which the Tiwanaku ruins bear silent testimony, represents a series of movements from the south. The Tiwanaku ruins also point to extensive dominion, and to ascertain its extent and locality, we must seek for similar Cyclopean work, and for similar Masonic skill in carving in other parts of Peru. In Cusco, there is a Cyclopean building in the Calle de Triunfo, with a huge monolith known as the Stone of 12 Corners. Some portions of the ancient remains at Ollantaytampu are megalithic work, as well as the Inca Mesana and the Nuestra Tiana, hewn out of the solid rock. But the grandest and most imposing work of the megalithic builders was the fortress at Cusco. The Sacsayhuaman hill, on which the fortress stood overlooking the city, was practically inaccessible on two sides and easily defensible on another. But the eastern face was exposed to easy approach, and here the great Cyclopean work was constructed. It consists of 3 parallel walls, 330 yards in length each, with 21 advancing and retiring angles, so that at every point an attack could be enfiladed by defenders. The outer wall, at its salient angles, had stones of the following dimensions: 14 feet high by 12, another 10 foot by 6. There must have been some good cause for the erection of this marvellous defensive work of which we know nothing. Its origins is as unknown as that of the Tiwanaku ruins. The Incas knew nothing. Garcilaso refers to towers, walls, and to gates built by the Incas, and even gives the names of the architects, but these were later defences built within the great Cyclopean fortress. The outer lines must be attributed to the megalithic age. There is nothing of the kind which can be compared to them in any other part of the world. At Chavin, in the valley of the Maranon, there is Cyclopean work, and also in Chachapoyas. In seeking for indications of the megalithic age to be found in the elaborate carving of stones, we at once turn to the great monoliths at Conchacha, near Abancay, and to the stone of Chavin. At Conchacha, the huge sacrificial stone is of limestone, about 20 feet long by 14 by 12. It is carved in channels for leading away liquids and in other forms. It points to the megalithic age, as does the circular stone with much fine workmanship in alto relievo, the great seats cut out of monoliths, and the flight of stone steps to form an artificial cascade. On the Chavin stone, we once again have the deity holding 2 scepters, as at Tiwanaku. This stone was found in around 1840 in the parish of Chavin de Huantar, in the province of Huari, and within the valley of the Maranon. Here there is a curious Inca ruin known as the Pucara de Chavin. The stone had fallen from the ruins above, but it does not follow that it was the same age as the ruins. It was probably once part of a much more ancient edifice, afterwards used to adorn the more recent Inca fortress. In 1874, the stone was taken to Lima by order of the government, where it may now be seen. End quote. Markham here describes in detail the features of the Chavin stone, which is quite a remarkable piece of work. He claims that it's made from diorite, and as mentioned, it was removed from the site of Chavin to Lima in the 1800s, where you can still see it in a museum today. Note the precise flatness to the stone. I understand there have been requests made to try and quantify the degree of flatness shown by the surface of this stone with metrology equipment, but no permissions have been granted for this, at least as far as I know. There is a replica of this stone at Chavin de Huanta, which is a site that not many people visit as it's to the north of Lima and quite distant from the Sacred Valley, but it's well worth the trip. As Markham states, and I agree with him, it's likely that Chavin de Huanta was an Inca site that was built on top of a far more ancient and megalithic one. It has many underground labyrinths and chambers that you can explore, including one with the Lanzon stone, which is a depiction of a deity, and I will do a video on this site and my visit there at some point in the future. Markham draws a comparison between the artwork on the Chavin stone and that on the Sun Gate at Tiwanaku as being similar, yet the Chavin stone is somehow more artistic and abstract, with more curves than the artwork at Tiwanaku. Resuming Clements Markham again. Quote, "The same general idea appears to prevail in both the central figures at Tiwanaku and on the Chavin stone. They represent the genius of the same people and the same civilization, though at different periods, the Chavin stone being the latest. In both, the pervading idea is of a figure of the deity grasping a scepter in each hand. The bands or rays, terminating with heads or with circles and volutes, are the same in both. At Tiwanaku, all the parts of the carving appear to have a symbolical meaning. The artist avoided all curves, preferring straight lines and correctly drawn rectangles. Everything seems to have had an intention or a meaning. In the Chavin stone, the conception is more confused, and there is much that is more ornate, but apparently conventional and unmeaning. The two compositions, it may be concluded, are the work of the same people, with the same cult, the same art, the same traditions, but with an interval of perhaps a century or two between them. There must once have been other stones of the same character. One was probably at Quecha, another at Cusco, belonging to the same megalithic age. If they had not been destroyed, we could trace the transition from the earlier and simpler style, full of meaning, at Tiwanaku, to the more elaborate and corrupt work on the Chavin stone. Guided by the existence of megalithic ruins and by the carved stones, we are led to the tentative conclusion that the ancient empire extended its sway over the Andean regions from an unknown distance south of Tucumán to Chachapoyas, with Tiwanaku, for want of the real name, as its centre of rule and of thought. We may also entertain two provisional conclusions, one of them touching the great antiquity of the megalithic civilization, and the other with reference to the area over which it prevailed. But we must return to the most difficult part of the problem, namely the climatic conditions. How could such a region as is described at the beginning of this essay, where corn cannot ripen, sustain the population of a great city over 12,000 feet above the level of the sea? Could the elevation have been less? Is such an idea beyond the bounds of possibility? The height is now 12,500 feet above the sea level, in latitude 16 degrees 22 minutes south. The recent studies of southern geology and botany lead to the belief in a connection between South America and the Antarctic continental lands. But at a remote geological period, there was no South America, only three land masses, separated by great sea inlets, a Guinea, a Brazil, and a La Plata island. There were no Andes. Then came the time when the mountains began to be upheaved. The process appears to have been very slow, gradual, and long continued. The Andes did not exist at all in the Jurassic, or even in the Cretaceous period. Comparatively speaking, the Andes are very modern. The bones of a mastodon have been discovered at Loma in Bolivia, which is now 13,000 feet above the sea. But such an animal could not have existed at such an elevation. Then, again, in the deserts of Tarapacá, embedded in the sides of ravines, there are numerous skeletons of gigantic anteaters, animals whose habitat is a dense forest. When they lived, the deserts in which their bones are found must have been covered with trees. It is the height of the Andes, wringing all moisture out of the trade wind, which makes Tarapacá a desert. When the Andes were lower, the trade wind could carry its moisture over them to the strip of coastland, which is now an arid desert, producing arboreal vegetation and the means of supporting gigantic anteaters. When mastodons lived at Iloma and anteaters in Tarapacá, the Andes, slowly rising, were some 2,000 or 3,000 of feet lower than they are now. Maize would then ripen in the basin of Lake Titicaca, and the site of the ruins of Tiwanaku could support the necessary population. If the megalithic builders were living under these conditions, the problem is solved. If this is geologically impossible, the mystery remains unexplained. We have indications of the megalithic civilization, of the direction whence it came, of its great antiquity, of the extent of the ancient empire, deduced from the ruins and carved stones, and of the religious feeling, shown by a central figure worshipped by men and the brute creation. We know nothing more about the mysterious megalithic people, unless any light can be thrown on them by a consideration of the long list of kings, which will form the subject of the next chapter." End quote. There is a whole lot to unpack from that essay by Clements Markham. As he said, almost all of the primary sources speak of Tiwanaku as being tremendously ancient, and of the Inca merely using and repairing the site rather than originally building it. I think his analysis of the connection between the Chavin stone and the Tiwanaku monument is spot on. I'm going to let his words and his research stand for themselves, and instead offer 2 points based on some more modern research. Firstly, Markham identified the real mystery held by this ancient land, namely how it was possible for such an endeavour as Tiwanaku to be undertaken, given the altitude and the ecosystem of the high Bolivian Altiplano. He hits on some very salient points, with the remains of both mastodons and giant anteaters, both species of megafauna that went extinct around the time of the Younger Dryas cataclysm, which would have been entirely unknown to Markham. He points out that neither animal could have existed given the current climate and altitude, and he speculates that there may well have been some significant geological upheaval that affected both of them, and then therefore the viability of a city such as Tiwanaku. I think that today we can offer another explanation, that of traumatic and violent climate change, which we now know with certainty happened on the back of the Younger Dryas event, and I explored the impact of this cataclysm on South America in detail in a video on this channel last year. The second point that I'd offer here is that despite his lifetime of research, Markham still acknowledges that none of his conclusions are certain, and that the mystery presented by both Tiwanaku and the megalithic ruins of Peru persist. Again, we find that our Victorian-era explorers and archaeologists are much more open to the mystery and the enigma that the history of human civilization on this planet represents. Much like Flinders Petrie with regards to Egypt, Clements Markham knew when he was looking at something remarkable in the megalithic work of the ancients. This is work that is unexplainable when considering the capabilities of the known ancient civilizations that were the last to occupy these sites. As I said earlier in this video, I find the insistence of our current archaeological establishment and academia to declare all of these mysteries solved to be quite perplexing, as it seems, at least to me, that there is much evidence that is contrary to this simple explanation that the Inca created all of it. Rather than ignoring or dismissing opposing forms of evidence, our tenured establishment might be better served. Indeed, tourism and interest in these topics in general might also be better served by acknowledging that perhaps there is more to learn here, and that our current accounting for the origins of human civilization could well be wrong, that it may go back much further in time to an age of advanced capability, of high technology civilizations that were at some point struck down and mankind forced to begin again. Their Victorian-era predecessors certainly seemed open-minded enough to accept and explore this premise. Thanks for watching. Hey all, I hope you found that to be somewhat interesting. I've lately been just getting a tremendous amount of value from some of these older sources of information that deal with ancient cultures and civilizations. I came across Markham's work while I was doing research for another video, and I thought, you know, I'll stop, and it just really struck me, that chapter on the megalithic age, and I was like, I'll do a quick video based on this, and I changed tack, and it was anything but quick. It's just that's the research sort of takes you in a direction, and away you go. I end up with another 50-minute video. But I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed putting it together, and as I said, there's a lot to be said for some of these older sources. And you know, as part of that, there's been a lot going on here in the background while I'm making these. I've been getting deep into these books on Tiwanaku from Poznański. You saw a few images from these books in this video, and I will be producing some detailed looks at what he said about Tiwanaku as well, because you know, Poznański agreed with Markham in terms of, you know, dating that site back to, you know, far beyond the Inca and deep into antiquity. He had a number of other methods that he used to date those sites. It's all really interesting stuff. Something else that I'm planning on getting into and making is, I think it's time to kind of put together a bit more of an overview about how I can stitch all of these different sites and all of these videos together, because, you know, ultimately the purpose isn't really to prove so much the existence of some, you know, advanced civilization in the past for its own sake. Ultimately, the point I'm trying to make with all of that, by reinforcing that idea that it's possible, is what it really means for us today, because, you know, it's a fundamental tenet of what it means to be a human on this planet today. I think most people have this connection to the evolution of technology and progression from the Stone Age that we all think started around 6,000 years ago. You know, we were Stone Age, we went to agricultural civilizations, we had the Romans and a few other civilizations, ups and downs in the middle, but then in the last, you know, 1,000 years we got on this path, and here we are. I think that's a fundamental component of what it means to be a human. But if more people were aware that, well, okay, maybe there's been, you know, advanced civilizations in the past, and what happened to them, we essentially got knocked all the way back to the Stone Age. I think that realization would kind of shake some of our priorities. If more people around the world understood our history in terms of the history of civilization, and that we're simply just, you know, the latest kind of revolution of human civilization, it might change some of our priorities. We might take a look at some of the reasons for that knockback, being in particular the younger Dryas and the threat that comes from the cosmic environment that we all live in. And, you know, hopefully I'd like to think that eventually that's something that, you know, could help to change our priorities as a species, as, you know, as lofty a goal as that might be. I think ultimately that's what that type of awareness and knowledge of our history can teach us, because that's the old saying, right? Those who ignore the lessons from the mistakes of history are bound to repeat them. In any case, those are all part of the plans that I've got for going forward. If you like that idea, if you want to see the channel continue, please do consider supporting the channel via the value for value model. There's a number of ways to do that. It's all outlined at unchartedx.com/support. I do want to say just a huge thank you to everybody that does choose to support the channel and what I'm doing. It really is the only way I'm able to produce these videos. Putting these together, doing the research, the writing, and then all of the editing, it takes a lot of my time. And yeah, I'm really appreciative, particularly in these sort of crazy times that we're living through. I hope everyone out there is doing well with all of that. And I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing here, and I'll see you all in the next one. Cheers.